Good afternoon, everyone. iTech welcomes all the participants for today's National Distance Learning Seminar Series. Today's topic is Resistance to Antiretrovirals and Treatment Switch, and speaker is Dr. Anwar Parvez. Dr. Anwar is a public health specialist and HIV/TB physician. He is a fellow in HIV from International Training and Education Center for Health. He is presently serving iTech India as director, where he is working in close coordination with NACO in providing national and regional level technical assistance for strengthening capacities of COEs across the country and assisting HIV treatment program. He also works as a clinical assistant professor for Department of Global Health, University of Washington in Seattle. He is a national level trainer and is also a member of various guidelines writing groups of NACO. His major areas of interest include training, capacity building, curriculum development, distance learning, HIV/AIDS and TB program management, and public health intervention programs. We welcome you, sir, for today's NDLS session. I would request Dr. Anwar now to kindly take over the session.
Thank you, Deepya. Good afternoon, everyone. So today's NDLS is on resistance to antiretroviral and treatment switch. We do this a session on this topic almost once in every year. So this might be a repetition for some of you, and for others it might be a new session. So this will be the session content today. The basic concepts of resistance to antiretrovirals. When we deal with HIV positives at ART center, when we start them on ART, there are certain things which we in the program which we do not use those tools for diagnosing resistance. For example, the resistance testing for that matter. We are not doing that in the NACO program, but we need to understand the basic concepts of resistance, because it will definitely affect the line of treatments of HIV positives. That means after first line, when we start patients on second line and third line, we need to have a general idea about how ART or what happens to first line ART and why we change that first line ART to second line and from second line to third line. There are some tests which are available to identify the resistance to antiretroviral. These are genotypic and phenotypic resistance testing. We will be talking about more on genotypic testing, as phenotypic testing is not being used in the clinical settings. Then we will also see the interpretation of genotypic reports and the tools to interpret those reports. So there are some databases which are commonly used. So as a treating physicians or as a technical experts, I think we should be aware of those databases which will help us to diagnose or interpret those genotypic reports. And then clinical significance of resistance, and the more important part in terms of practicing will be the NACO guidelines on treatment switch. So usually treatment switch is advised by the SASEP, but as an ART medical officer and ART counselors, I think we should be aware of the line of management which is recommended by the national program after the failure of first line ART. So there are some disclaimers. As I said, the last bullet, the NACO guidelines are very straightforward. That will be from the programmatic guidelines. So we'll try to discuss how those guidelines have been developed. Rest of the part may not be directly there in the national guidelines as such, but it is definitely being considered when we do treatment switches. So we need to understand the concepts of resistance, and based on that, we will be able to understand that how the treatment guidelines are developed in terms of second and third line recommendations of ART. So let's start with the first part of the presentation about resistance to antiretroviral therapy. So basic concepts of resistance. When you start ART, first of all, we don't do baseline viral load testing for any patients whom we start on ART, which is, I think, very clear to everyone. As per the recent NACO guidelines, we do viral load test only after 6 months of ART initiation. But when we start ART in any patients, what do we expect? Suppose the baseline viral load is done in some patient, and we know that the viral load is very high. After starting ART, we expect the viral load to go down. And we expect the viral load to go down in a manner that after 8 weeks or 12 weeks of ART, it should go beyond or below undetectable levels. So that is TND, that is our basic objective or basic target that we should have. But even if it goes below 1000 copies per ml viral load, if after 6 months of ART it goes below 1000 copies per ml, we say that viral load is suppressed. So ultimately, after starting ART, this is what we want to achieve, that there should be a viral load suppression which should happen after initiation of ART, and the curve should look like this. But in some cases, what happens after initial drop, which we saw in the previous graph, if the patient does not take ART properly, if there are any issues with the drug adherence to ART, or if the ART is suppose not working in that particular patient, then the viral load again goes up after some time of suppression, and this is called as virologic rebound. So you started ART with the high viral load, it reduced the viral load to a level which is undetectable or maybe below 1000, which is suppressed viral load, and after some time, because of poor adherence or adherence issues, the viral load may again go high, which is called as virological rebound. But in some cases, what happens is there will be incomplete virological response. You start ART from high viral load, but viral load never go below 1000, and the patient will be on low level viremia continued for long time. So this also happens. This may be also because of poor adherence to ART and also because of resistance, which means basically that in presence of drug, virus continues to multiply. So if you are giving ART, ideally it should control the viral multiplication. Virus should not multiply in presence of ART or active ART medications. But if virus continues to multiply in presence of ART, that's what we call as resistance to ART. Now this is actually pictorial depiction of how the evolution of drug resistance to drug-resistant HIV happens. Imagine that this is pre-treatment status, and these brown dots are called as wild virus, which is a natural virus or HIV virus, typical natural known HIV virus, and these colored dots are resistant HIV viruses. So before starting ART, the majority of the viral population in a person living with HIV will be of wild virus type. There can be some resistant mutant strains, but these will be very few in number, and the wild virus number outweighs the number of resistant mutant strains. And that is why when we start ART, initially there will be a good response, and these resistant viruses, they are actually not strong enough to increase their own population. They are fragile, because they actually have changed themselves, and it is now becomes difficult for them to survive. So they are weak in multiplication, they are fragile viruses, but as against the wild virus is actually a fit virus which will form the majority of the population of HIV in a pre-treatment patient. Now once you start ART, which is drug sensitive drugs, if you are giving the ART to a positive, so we are expecting this wild virus count to go down, because there will be stop in multiplication, or ART will actually control the multiplication of the viruses, so new viral copies will not form and there will be sudden drop in viral load. But as I said before, this resistant virus is usually not that fit for survival, so its number also goes down, but some strains will remain in the patient's blood. But if the patient does not take ART properly, if there are adherence problems, if the patient is suppose taking ART and if the patient is missing some doses in between, so what happens is the resistant viruses will get a chance to come up and again multiply. Because if the adherence problem continues to happen or continue to happen for a longer duration of time, then again as wild virus is under control because of the drug pressure which the patient is taking drugs in between. So whenever the patient takes drugs or ART medications, wild virus number will go down, but resistant viruses will again surge up, or they will get the opportunity to multiply. If the adherence problems continues, then these wild viruses will make more and more copies, and now the patient will have more resistant viruses than the naturally occurring wild virus. But what happens is if the patient continues on this, there will be accumulation of these mutant viruses. There will be more and more number of mutant viruses, and that is why ART is not working. Viral load will not come down because the ART which we are giving here is sensitive to control only wild viruses. But if you stop ART, what happens is the wild virus will again get the opportunity to multiply because here the drug pressure has been removed. So viral load of the wild virus will increase, but at the same time, even resistant viruses, because the number was huge, they will also increase. So this is what happens once you start ART in a patient who is HIV positive, and if you if the patient does not take ART properly, this is what happens is number of resistant viruses increases. Now, how can we know about it? What do we do as of now? As of now, we don't do this viral load test at the baseline. We start ART in a patient and we see viral load after 6 months of ART initiation in new patients. That is what we are doing right now as per the present guidelines. And that's what we are expecting, that after 6 months, viral load should be suppressed. And in our definition of NACO, suppression means viral load of less than 1000 copies per ml. Even though TND will be ideal, but we are happy if the viral load is less than 1000 copies per ml. So beyond that, we don't have anything to say that like which is the resistant mutant which has emerged or why the ART is not working. Now, if this adherence problem continues for a longer duration of time, then ART itself will become resistant. Even after that, if suppose adherence is made better, that line of ART will not work because majority of the population will be the resistant type of viruses. So in this, in the future few slides, we will try to learn about how these mutations they occur and how the mutations or these resistance testing is done in the lab. So if you want to know that which are the mutations, first of all, as I mentioned before, what are the indication of HIV drug resistance testing or genotypic testing? Now, whenever we say drug resistance testing, we are talking about genotyping here. So in NACO program, it is neither indicated nor available. But there are, for example, US guidelines and other countries also, they have their own guidelines, but standard United States DHHS guidelines, they give these indications. They do actually genotypic testing at the baseline, at the time if they diagnose acute retroviral infection also. That is before ART initiation, just to know that which ART need to be started in the patient. We don't have that luxury. But I'll tell you that why we are okay with that, that even if we don't have that baseline genotypic testing, whatever we are doing is not inferior. And if the patient is having viral load more than 1000, then also they do genotypic testing to identify which are the mutations and what ART is to be given if first line is failing in those patients. Then patients with suboptimal HIV RNA suppression, we saw that there will be some patients who do not achieve viral suppression, and there will be low level viremia in the patients for a longer duration of time. And the patients who are pregnant women, because again there are here the risk is dual, one for the mother and also for the baby. So to prevent that, pregnant women also becomes one of the indications for doing drug resistant testing or genotypic testing. Now, these are some basic principles of genotype. How they do is they separate plasma, and from this plasma they extract HIV virus. We all know that HIV is an RNA virus, so they extract HIV RNA from the blood plasma, and they do reverse transcription the way it happens in the blood naturally. So they do it in the lab. So reverse transcription happens. That means from HIV RNA, DNA is formed, and then there will be amplification of this DNA. So this is again a not easy process as such in the lab also, but DNA strands are amplified and DNA sequencing is done. So HIV genomes are prepared in the lab, and these genes, which is having these amino acid sequences, now these genes of the from the patient's blood, they are compared with the wild type of known viral genetic sequence. So this is, for example, HIV gene DNA sequence of wild type, which is known. Now they have done this typing. They know at what number of amino acid or in the sequence of amino acid, on which number what amino acid you expect. So this is what they have as a known HIV genome. So from the test, that means this which we identify from the sample of the patient, they compare this with the wild type of virus gene, and from that they see if there is any change. If it is exactly same, then there is no mutation as such, there is no mutation which has appeared. But if there is any change in the sequence, then they'll report. So the three basic enzymes, that is reverse transcriptase inhibitors and protease inhibitors and integrase inhibitors, these are the three common classes of the drugs for which this genotype testing is done. So for example, in this case, there is methionine at 184th position. This is methionine is a name of amino acid which is at 184th position of the virus. Now if it is changed to valine, for example, so it is written like this, M184V mutation. So basically what they are doing is they are extracting the viral DNA sequence. They are comparing that viral DNA sequence from the patient with the wild type of viral DNA sequence, and they are seeing that if there is any change. If there is any change which has happened, which means the virus has changed its structure, that means a mutation has appeared. Now the way they write this mutation is, as I said, at 184th position of the DNA sequence or polypeptide change, there should be methionine which has been replaced by valine. So, and how they interpret these reports is, for example, this is written like this, M184V mutation, where 184 is actually amino acid position, M is wild type of amino acid, and it has been replaced by valine, so they write as M184V mutation. So the mutation you will see from now on will be written like this, that the position of the amino acid in the wild type of virus, what amino acid was expected, and in the mutant virus, what amino acid actually was seen. So now how to do or how to interpret this mutation. For example, you sent a blood and the lab identified that there is a presence of this mutation in the patient's blood. So what does it mean? That and how this report is to be interpreted. So you need not remember how to interpret these reports. There are some databases which are very handy, very free databases, and they are updated very quite often. And whenever you log into those databases, you can just use that interpretation report. These days in the private, when they do this genotypic testing, even private labs actually use the same databases to give you interpretation report. So one of these databases is this, that is you can go online and just check it out for yourself. It is hivdb.stanford.edu. This is the name of the database, and this is the link for that. Once you click this in any Google Chrome or other engines, so you will find this page will appear, and then here there is HIV DB program. If you click on this, it will take you to the genotyping HIV DB program. So here you have different cells for entering the mutation reports, like reverse transcriptase mutations, protease mutations, integrase mutations. You need to click on this drop down menu, and then accordingly, for example, if it is 184V mutation, you need to go to 184 here. So whenever you go to 184, you need to click on this drop down menu. It will be, if it is 184V, M184V, so you need to select V in presence of M. So once you enter all these mutations, whatever mutations you get from the lab, then there will be a cell here which will say analyze. So if you click on analyze, it will give the interpretation of the results. But as I said, if you don't want to go into this, it is fine, because these days in the private, when they give you report, they actually come up with the mutation report also. So our interpretation of the mutations as well. Now how to use that? First of all, for our other colleagues who are not medical officers in the ERT center, what we can do is, because as you might have realized by now that it is not easy to deal with these mutations sometimes, and the changing from first line to second line, though it appears easy because it has been made easy by NACO, it is, and there are a lot of things which are at stake when we deal with the patients on ART. So we need to prevent HIV drug resistance as much as we can, so that we can continue more and more patients on first line ART for longer duration of time. So what we need to do is, when we start ART, we need to adequately prepare the patient or client for ART. So we usually call it as preparedness counseling or ART preparedness counseling. So we need to explain each and everything about the ART. We need to identify what can be the perceived barriers of for good adherence, and if there are any barriers, we need to counsel the patients properly so that the patients adhere to the treatment for longer duration of time. So for that, we need to select the appropriate regimen as per the NACO guidelines, and we need to NACO guidelines will discuss that there are the drug combinations which are being used in NACO guidelines. There are very potent drugs which are being used, but these drugs should also have higher genetic barrier to resistance. I'll explain what it means later. Then if there are any side effects, if the patient, suppose you start the patient on the TLE as a first line and the patient is complaining of suppose giddiness or something, that has to be addressed, which doesn't mean that you need to treat each and every side effect. But for example, if the patient is complaining of giddiness, if no one is talking to that patient that how it can go down, or how you can get relief with this side effect, because usually it is self-limiting, and after a month's time patients usually feel better, and then lifelong they actually work good on TLE. So of course there are some patients where we need to make some changes in the ART, but majority of the patients, they well tolerate this TLE regimen. So if they have any problem, that has to be addressed. So for that, only for initial 3 to 6 months, we need to be very, very careful that we need to be in touch with the patient, even if the patient is not in touch with us. For example, if there are any side effect, we can give a call in between, or whatever strategy we are adopting, we need to make sure that our patients are adherent to the treatment. So we need to emphasize and re-emphasize on adherence and monitor them regularly to detect any non-adherence. And that is why now for new patients we are doing even viral load after 6 months, so that if the viral load is not suppressed, we can definitely know that the ART is not working because of either poor adherence or because of resistance to antiretrovirals. So now this is a chart which you need not remember. Now again, there is one disclaimer which I forgot to give, that in this presentation you might be listening about some of the drugs which are not being used in the NACO program. Some may not be available in India also, but as a for conceptual understanding of the topic, I think it will be good to know about those drugs. Few lines about those drugs. Now if you look at this graph, it has two axes like any graph, x-axis and y-axis. So on the x-axis you will see about the potency of these drugs, that how strong the drug is to fight against HIV or to prevent multiplication of HIV, and then barrier to resistance or genetic barrier to resistance. That means how many mutations you require, how many mutations a drug require to become resistant, or a virus requires to become resistant to a particular ART medication. So what is the ideal position in this graph is right upper quadrant. So right upper corner, so this is the ideal position, that the drug which we are using should be very potent and should be having highest genetic barrier to resistance. That means it should actually control the HIV virus in a stronger way, and also even if there are some mutations against that particular drug, it still should be okay. The drug should still be sensitive for those viral populations. So in any regimen, if you talk about, there are two parts of an ART regimen. By regimen I mean TLE is a regimen, ZLN is a regimen which has like triple drugs. So there are two parts of a regimen where we call as NRTI backbone, and the later part we call as anchor drug. For example, in ZLN, the Z and L, zidovudine and lamivudine, these are called as NRTI backbone, and the third drug is called as anchor drug. So sometimes we give NNRTIs and sometimes we give protease inhibitors, and sometimes and so these are the two different parts of the regimen. So we want a strong anchor drug to strong means most potent anchor drug to have successful outcomes of ART medications. But at the same time, if you just see the potency and genetic barrier of NRTI backbone, the drugs which we use like zidovudin, tenofovir, TAF, which is tenofovir alafenamide, and abacavir, which are currently being used in the program, and 3TC, which is lamivudine, and FTC, which is emtricitabine. These are again the drugs which are potent drugs and also which have some genetic barrier to resistance. But if you compare this with the anchor drug, now these are all anchor drugs like NNRTIs and protease inhibitors. Nevirapine and efavirenz, if you see, these are though very potent drugs, which means they are very strong drugs, but in terms of barrier to resistance they are very low. That means if there are if the patient is missing suppose few doses, or patient is not adherent to the treatment, and if this is repeated frequently, very quickly, or because of even suppose one mutation, the efavirenz may become ineffective. But at the same time, if you see the other drugs like raltegravir, lopinavir, bictegravir, dolutegravir, and darunavir, and again this is cobicistat, which is similar to ritonavir. So these are the drugs which are having higher genetic barrier to resistance, as in they are very potent drugs and they are having higher genetic barrier to resistance, which means that even if the patient is not adherent to the treatment, the drug will still be effective. So that is why if you see in the first line we have these drugs, and if the patient is failing first line, we switch to the either atazanavir ritonavir based regimen, or in the third line we have darunavir ritonavir. Some of you might have heard about this new drug which is coming up, that is dolutegravir, which is an integrase inhibitor. That is also coming in first line in NACO program also after some time. This has been agreed. We are still waiting for the drugs to come, and that might come sooner than later. So like by next year it might come into the program for the new patients. So we are moving towards more and more potent patients, but the currently whatever regimen we are using, they are again very potent regimen we are using, and also they have very higher genetic barrier to resistance. For example, darunavir ritonavir, which we are using as third line PI, and also in some cases it is being used as alternate second line PI. So we'll come to that. So if we focus on NRTI resistance or resistance to NRTI, which are the NRTI we are using? These are zidovudin, lamivudin, and abacavir, and NTRTI, that is nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitor, which is tenofovir. So these are the drugs which we are using. So here is a question for you all. For the same mutation, this again you might be listening about this maybe like fourth or fifth time now, because this is the most common mutation which is appeared, and this is the first mutation which usually gets appear. Here is a case: 27-year-old woman received TLE in a private hospital, and after achieving virological suppression at 6 months, she developed virologic breakthrough or rebound due to some adherence problem. That means the patient took ART for 6 months, and now after 6 months viral load is done, and now the viral load is again more than 1000. And an HIV drug resistance testing or genotype testing was performed for that patient in the private hospital, and the only mutation you see as a result is M184V mutation. Now the question is, what impact does the M184V mutation have on tenofovir? Does it cause high level resistance and markedly reduce the susceptibility of HIV to tenofovir? Or does it cause low level resistance and slightly reduces susceptibility of HIV to tenofovir, or increases susceptibility of HIV to tenofovir? So one of the answers we received is A, which is very logical answer in fact, that if you have one mutation, so there should be high level resistance to HIV. But in contrast, actually if you see, actually what happens is C, which is increases susceptibility of HIV to tenofovir. Now this is one thing I know why Gokak ART Center responded A, because if you look at TB bacilli, for example, and if you do resistant testing in TB, usually they will give result as it is most resistant to this drug and that drug. So but in ART that doesn't work. So if there is a presence of a mutation, so that mutation can be causing resistance to one particular ART medication, but at the same time, same mutation may cause increased susceptibility of other drug. So this might happen in the ART, and that is what actually we want to see in this session. Now, in presence of 184V, I'll give you again an example. This is wild type of HIV and NRTI. So this is suppose a resistance scale, and this is sensitive. This position is again of sensitivity. So here the drug is sensitive. So all these drugs are sensitive to this wild type of virus, tenofovir, zidovudine, abacavir, lamivudine, and emtricitabine. On the left side, it is high level resistance. On the right side, it is increased susceptibility, which I was talking about just now. That if the patient, if there is in presence of few particular mutations, which may cause resistance to some particular drug, but the same mutation can cause increased susceptibility of some other drug to that particular wild type of HIV virus. So if we look at this example of M184V mutation or M184I mutation, so this mutation is actually related to lamivudine. So as I said, if there are any adherence issues, this drug lamivudine has least genetic barrier to resistance, and the first mutation to appear will be M184V. So in presence of M184V, lamivudine and emtricitabine will be completely out because there will be high level resistance to these drugs. But if you look at, and even abacavir for an extent, it will be causing resistance to abacavir also, maybe low level resistance. But if you look at tenofovir and zidovudine, what has happened to these two drugs, they have moved to the right side. That susceptibility of these two drugs have been increased because of presence of this mutation. So what I'm trying to say by this slide is, you might have seen or you might have observed this, that in first line we use tenofovir, lamivudine and efavirenz. And if it fails, in the second line we give, for example, zidovudine, lamivudine and atezanavir-ritonavir. So one drug which we are still continuing using was lamivudine. Lamivudine we used in the first line, and lamivudine we also used in the second line. Why we did was because of this reason. Now using lamivudine in the second line is not actually, lamivudine is not doing any harm to the virus in the virus of the patient in whom we are giving second line, but the presence of lamivudine actually maintains this mutation 184V, which in turn increases susceptibility of zidovudine and tenofovir, so that our second line, the zidovudine which we are using in the second line, is much more effective than before because its susceptibility has increased. So maintaining particular mutation is actually a good for a successful outcome of treatment, which is a good thing for us. That is why lamivudine is used in the first line and also in the second line in the NACO program. Now, if you look at the other drugs, now some might have heard this TAM or thymidine analogs mutations. So zidovudine and stavudine are thymidine analogs, and the mutations which are developed for these two drugs are called as thymidine analog mutations. Now you need not remember this list of mutations here, which is called as TAMS, but one thing which you can remember is, for lamivudine we just said that presence of 184V may cause resistance to lamivudine, but for thymidine analogs there need to be more than one mutations for the drug to become resistant to that particular virus. So for zidovudine and lamivudine, you may or may not remember all these, but they are called as TAMS. So there is accumulation of mutation. One point we can remember here is, if suppose your patient is on ZLN and patient is showing adherence issues, patient is not taking ART regularly. So if adherence happens repeatedly, or if adherence issues happen repeatedly, patient try to miss medications once, twice, thrice, then there will be accumulation of these mutations. If suppose patient is non-adherent, there will be some mutations which will appear, but if non-adherence continue for longer duration of time, again multiple mutations appear. So one mutation may not cause resistance to zidovudin, but if there is accumulation of thymidine analog mutations, both zidovudin and stavudine will not work after that. There was a question, do this increases susceptibility to even lamivudine? No, so actually lamivudine will become resistant, but the presence of 184V increase susceptibility of zidovudine and tenofovir. Now again, let's see what happens with this thymidine analog mutations. Again, the same chart. So in presence of 184V, which I said, because again these drugs are not used as a single drug, they are used in a combination, zidovudin and lamivudin. And lamivudin, as I said, first mutation to appear is here, and because of which lamivudin and efavirenz and emcitabine are out. And but if there is accumulation of 3 TAMS, like more than one, as I said, thymidine analog mutations, tenofovir, zidovudin, abacavir, and all are out. Now, if this continues for longer duration of time, again more and more accumulation happens, which result in again complete resistance to those drugs. Now, let's see about tenofovir. So, tenofovir again we give in combination with either emcitabine or with lamivudin. Again, the first mutation to appear will be M184V. Now, then after that is K65R is another mutation which is actually related to tenofovir. So, in presence of K65R, tenofovir will be resistant in those patients. So, here is again a question which is similar to the previous one. What NRTI is typically most active against the K65R mutation? Those who know can answer this. ART Hospet has answered B, which is actually a right answer, that in presence of K65R, tenofovir will not work, but the other drug which becomes more sensitive is zidovudin. Again, if you look at this picture, this is in presence of K65R, tenofovir is most resistant. Abacavir, again, there is a pathway which abacavir follows, which is similar to tenofovir. That is in presence of K65R, abacavir may also not work. Lamivudin and emcitabine will not work because of our earlier thing, that is M184V. That is why if the patient is failing on tenofovir, for example, if you have given TLE in the first line, in the second line you will see ZL, atazanavir, ritonavir, because again presence of this K65R is increasing susceptibility of zidovudin. So in the NACO guideline, if you see, they have considered all these phenomena, that if you are starting with tenofovir, what will be the preferred second line in those patients? If you are starting with zidovudin, what will be your preferred second line in those patients? So in this scenario, and that is why we have tenofovir as a preferred first line, because in contrast, if you see as a preferred first line, if you start a patient on ZLN, and if there is accumulation of thymidine analog mutations, tenofovir may or may not work in those patients, or it may work, but the susceptibility will not be as high as in this case, where we are using tenofovir in the first line and zidovudin in the second line. And this is why you will see preferred first line as tenofovir and not zidovudin. So this is again in presence of M184V and K65R, two mutations. Because of tenofovir, susceptibility of zidovudin has increased, but here if we add M184V mutation here, the zidovudin which was closer to the midline is now again moving towards right side. So this is why we use this is actually makes sense now when you use zidovudin, lamivudin, and atazanavir, ritonavir in second line, if your patient was on tenofovir, lamivudin, efavirenz on as a first line treatment. So as a summary for NRTI, you can remember these things, that because we don't do resistance testing, but we can expect which mutation to be present. If the patient was on zidovudin, lamivudin in the first line, or if the patient was on zidovudin, lamivudin, and abacavir in the first line, you can expect that there will be thymidine analog mutations along with 184V mutation because of lamivudin. If the patient was started on tenofovir and lamivudin, you can expect that because of lamivudin there will be presence of 184V, and because of tenofovir there can be presence of K65R mutation. Similarly, abacavir 3TC, There are again various pathways for abacavir other than K65R. L74V is also for abacavir, but it is again more than K65R, and also presence of 184V will cause resistance to 3TC. Zidovudine, lamivudine, again thymidine analog mutation. Zidovudine, abacavir, tenofovir, again K65R mutation may cause resistance to all these drugs. So this is what how we actually make a logic of first line, preferred second line, and third line in NACO program. This is what is expected resistant mutations in those patients. In terms of NNRTIs, again, I'll not go in details because of time constraint, but you can remember that K103N is the most common mutation, which actually, in presence of this, there will be a resistance to efavirenz and nevirapine both. And for example, in PPTCT program, if some woman was exposed to suppose nevirapine, and if you want to start that woman on ART now, then you don't use efavirenz, because you expect that because of that single dose nevirapine there will be presence of K103N mutation in that particular patient, and that is why you don't use this, but you use protease inhibitor as an anchor drug in that regimen. There are other mutations also which we won't be talking about, but just to inform you that because there are some mutations which may cause class resistance, because there are other drugs also, newer drugs which are coming in like rilpivirine, doravirine and itravirine, which are in addition to nevirapine and efavirenz in this group of NNRTIs. Now doravirine is one drug which is very potent, which has very high genetic barrier to resistance and may come in future for clinical use of for treatment. Now, while again if you look at the other class K103N, in presence of K103N, it does not cause any effect of this newer NNRTI medications, but in presence of this regimen, this mutation, efavirenz and nevirapine are highly resistant. But if this is E138K, doravirine, as I said, is a newer NNRTI which is very potent and again having higher genetic barrier to resistance. Even this mutation does not shake this drug. It is still in the midline, while all the other drugs are becoming resistant. Only Y181C is another mutation which actually moves even doravirine to the left side, but still it will have some activity. That is why I said that this can be one of the future drugs which will come in the clinical practice. As far as PIs are concerned, they have very or highest genetic barrier to resistance. Again, if you go up and up, the lowest will be atazanavir, ritonavir, and more than that, the drug which is having higher genetic barrier to resistance than atazanavir is lopinavir, and darunavir, ritonavir is again having highest genetic barrier to resistance, which means they will require multiple mutations to accumulate for the drug to become resistant to that particular virus. So this was one of the studies which was done to see whether we can give OD or BD darunavir. In our program we give OD, and by this study they concluded that darunavir 800 mg OD is actually equal to darunavir 600 mg BD, and that is why in the NACO program we give darunavir 600 mg OD. And they also compared the other effects of these drugs which were exactly similar. There is a question: when the patient's viral load is in lakhs, why do we have to wait for another 3 months and repeat viral load? This will increase the TAMS or maybe TAMS. I agree with you for some extent, but there is a problem there because we are taking our cutoff as 1000. We are not aiming at viral load undetectable, for that matter, to define viral load suppression. So if suppose I am doing a viral load, and if there is low level viremia, and the method by which we actually try to measure the adherence is not that foolproof. So we are actually dependent on this adherence calculation by measuring the pill count or self-reporting the patient of the patient. That is why if you see in your own documents, majority of the patients will have good adherence. Even then the viral load will be more than 1000. And if you work on the adherence, then after 3 months if you repeat, in the majority of the patients right now what we are seeing is those patients viral load has gone down, which means patients may or may not report to you the pill count correctly. And you are right in saying that if if it is because of resistance that viral load has come high, then we actually are allowing that TAMS to accumulate. But that is the another major reason is our majority of the patients is as we are not monitoring the method which we are using for monitoring of the adherence. It is we are not 100% sure that patient the high viral load or more than unsuppressed viral load is because of poor resistance. It may be because of poor adherence also, and here we also get an opportunity to work on the adherence of that patient. That is why we are not waiting for longer duration of time. If suppose you repeat the viral load after 6 months of time, this is again a big time for allowing the virus to multiply even in the presence of mutations, which will cause again more accumulation of TAMS. So that is the main reason why we actually repeat the viral load after 3 months, which is I think is a good enough time for repeat viral load, in which we also work on the adherence of the patients as well. Again, if you see the number, it doesn't matter much if it is in lakhs or thousands, because as I said, HIV is not or the ART is not actually directly killing the virus. It is actually blocking the multiplication of virus. In a day, HIV may form lakhs and lakhs of copies. So when you measure the viral load, it may be in lakhs, which doesn't mean that it. See, do not compare this with the CD4 count. CD4 takes its own time to increase from 200 to 500, but that doesn't happen with actually the viral copies per ml. So there will be a reduction in the viral copies, will be log reduction. That means if you are starting from suppose 5 lakhs, it may come down to 5,000. So that might happen in a shorter period of time as well. That is why we are not doing even baseline viral load testing. What we want to achieve is after 6 months of ART, if the viral load is going below 1000 or not. That is what we are more interested in. Okay. So integrase inhibitor, again we have multiple regimen. Right now in the program we have raltegravir, but as I mentioned before, dolutegravir is making its entry into the national program. The other drug is bictegravir, which is again a preliminary data is available. It is very similar to dolutegravir. Elbitagravir again we don't have, but these are the two future drugs which are at least dolutegravir is coming in as of now. Again, they have some primary mutations and secondary mutations. By and large, if you allow this again failing regimen to be continued, and patient again if is not adherent to the treatment, there will be secondary accumulation of mutations, and then there will be resistant to those drugs. Less is known about again the newer integrase transfer inhibitor drugs, but we know that if the adherence is poor, there can be class specific resistance also. Now I have covered this part, which may or may not be known to some of you, but the next part is majority of you is are aware about the treatment switch. So I'll quickly run through it in the remaining 10 minutes of the session. So what does it mean, treatment switch? As you know that we are having this first line, which means that the line of treatment which has been started in a patient who is naive for ART, that is new treatment. So that we call as first line. It doesn't depend on what drug you use in the first line. You may use PI also in some cases. You may use NNRTI also. So the next line of treatment after the first line fails, we call it as second line. And further after that, if second line fails, the next line treatment what we use is third line. So when a patient fails treatment, the next line we use, and when we change the regimen from one to another, that is called as treatment switch. So switching means the regimen is changed because of ART treatment failure, and where we change the entire regimen. So for doing this treatment switch, which are the some important points which we need to consider? In your white card section 4, you need to have to take the detailed history of ART while you register any new client in your ART center. So you need to ask about previous ART history of ART medications, start date, duration, whether under PPTCT program, whether there were any interruptions or medical medication changes because of side effects or toxicities. So patient may be experienced in ART before coming to you and in the ART center, and that is why we need to take this detailed history and record on the section 4 of the white card. Then when we start first line ART, we need to do clinical lab monitoring and also adherence monitoring of the patient. Under lab monitoring, we see CD4 and viral load. These are the two important tests which will tell us how our ART is doing, if it is working or not working. So adherence calculation is one of the important aspects in our program, but unfortunately in majority of the centers, recorded adherence may not be inaccurate. I'm not saying that ART staff is responsible for that, but sometimes even patients do not communicate to us properly. They may or may not tell you the real picture. Sometimes patients have become so smart that they will become they'll just bring to you only 2 pills, and you will record adherence as 100% or more than 95% adherence, which may or may not true. And sometimes in busy OPD, it is difficult for the counselors also to calculate that with the help of calculator, to put all that formula and remaining pills and all that. It becomes sometimes cumbersome, and some counselors, they just write looking at the pills if the adherence is more than 95 or less than 95. And that is why these days we are facing problems that after doing viral load, in many patients we are seeing viral load more than 1000, but when we repeat after 3 months of enhanced adherence counseling, viral load is going down. So poor adherence leads to increased risk of emerging resistance, but the method by which we measure the adherence is not, as I said, foolproof. But this is one of the applications which the counselors can use. It is available free on the Android Google player. So you can just type ART adherence calculator. It will you can just download and open and use this for adherence calculation. Again, but this is based on the pill count only. But the calculation will be made easier by this. So this is how what is being recommended now by NACO guidelines, that viral load need not be done at baseline, but it is to be done after 6 months after ART initiation, then after 12 months, and then every year, that is annual viral load. CD4 is to be done at baseline and every 6 months, but there is a caveat here that except for the children less than 5 years, that is more than 5 years, also in adolescents and adults, if the viral load is suppressed, that is less than 1000 copies per ml, and if the CD4 is more than 350 cells per cubic millimeter, then you may stop doing regular 6 monthly CD4. You may just continue doing annual viral load for that patient. So failure can be of 3 types: virological failure, immunological failure, and clinical failure. Virological failure means that even after taking 6 months of ART, regular ART, which means with good adherence, if the viral load is more than 1000 copies per ml, that is called as virological failure. And this is one thing based on which we take the decision, all important decisions these days. But earlier we used to also look at the immunological failure, which is also important as of now as well for some reasons. And this is how we define immunological failure, based on if CD4 is fallen below pre-therapy baseline, or 50% fall from on-treatment peak value, or if it is not rising above 100 even after 1 year of therapy. And once you get the viral load result, then this is the algorithm we follow, that if the viral load is less than 1000 copies, we continue the patient on the same treatment. If the viral load is more than 1000 copies per ml, we do step-up adherence counseling or enhanced adherence counseling, and we see that if the adherence is now increased to more than 95%, and if that is the case, we repeat the viral load. If it is less than 1000, again we continue on the same ART. If the viral load is more than 1000, then we refer the patient to SASEP for evaluation or for advice regarding switch of the treatment. So there are 4 types of patients. I won't go in details of this because, as I said, many of you are aware of this. But the patients who are started on Zidovudine, again, you please remember what we discussed in the first part of this presentation, that concept of mutations. But even if you don't remember that, you can still remember how the drug is changed from first line to second line. So Zidovudine, Lamivudine, Nevirapine, or Zidovudine, Lamivudine, Efavirenz, or Stavudine, Lamivudine, Nevirapine, or Stavudine, Lamivudine, Efavirenz. If that is the first line on which the patient is failing, then you can give tenofovir, Lamivudine, atezanavir, ritonavir. Again, pause here. If the patient has developed thymidine analog mutations, tenofovir we can use in second line, though it is not ideal, but using of the PI may balance this factor. That is why, but all old patients whom we had put on Zidovudine or Lamivudine or Stavudine based ART as a first line, tenofovir is good second line for them. Those who were started on tenofovir based first line, Zidovudine is actually better for them. But as you know that zidovudine cannot be used if hemoglobin is more than can only be used if hemoglobin is more than 9. That is why if hemoglobin is less than 9, you cannot use zidovudine in those cases, and the patient has already failed tenofovir. And if anyone is failing on tenofovir, you cannot use abacavir in that patient. So because both, if you remember the mutation name K65R, in presence of that, both these drugs will be out. That is the reason we use raltegravir in that case. But when you are using raltegravir, you may not be able to use atazanavir, ritonavir, because there is no much experience with this. That is why in presence, while you give raltegravir, you use lopinavir, ritonavir in that scenario. If your patient is co-infected with hepatitis B, then even when tenofovir is resistant, you still may continue to use tenofovir in that patient, not for HIV but for hepatitis B. And there are other scenarios where, if suppose the patients in past history, your patient was, for example, on SLN, and when this phase out of stavudine happened, you were asked to change stavudine to zidovudine if the hemoglobin is good, and if hemoglobin was not good, you were asked to change from stavudine to tenofovir. So if that if at that point of time of substitution, if the CD4 was declining, if you see from the record, then in those patients we consider that even tenofovir, even giving zidovudine may not be effective. That is why right now also we will use raltegravir in those patients. And some of the patients will be may be experienced to more than one NRTIs. Those are called as multi-NRTI exposed patients, and in them you may not be able to use tenofovir, zidovudine or stavudine, and in those patients you use raltegravir as in your first part of the regimen, and as an anchor you use lopinavir, because whenever you use raltegravir you don't use atazanavir. You either use lopinavir or you use darunavir, which is usually given as a third line. So similarly, if you are using lopinavir, ritonavir in the first line, which we give in pediatric patients these days, or HIV2 you give. HIV2 we'll talk about in the next slide, but if you use lopinavir, ritonavir because of drug toxicity or something in the first line, you will be using, you may use efavirenz in the second line also for this patient. TLE is an option for these patients. But if you cannot use that, then you may use darunavir, ritonavir in those patients. If you cannot use zidovudine or tenofovir, you may use raltegravir in place of NRTIs. So if your patient was actually is failing first line, and this PI was used because of side effect or toxicities to NNRTIs, and now if you want to use change the regimen from first line to second line, the first two drugs, again based on zidovudine or stavudine you will decide tenofovir, or based on tenofovir you will decide zidovudine. But as far as third drug is concerned, you will give upper or higher drug. Atazanavir, ritonavir, you give darunavir, ritonavir, but here you will give BD dose, not OD dose, because you are using the same class of drug without using another class of drug. So because no new class is being used, that is why you are giving darunavir, ritonavir as BD here. And if you cannot use zidovudine, obviously you will use raltegravir in those cases. And if your patient was on PI base because of HIV2, again you will use higher PI, that is after lopinavir, ritonavir, you will not give atazanavir, ritonavir in second line, but you will give darunavir, ritonavir. But as the patient has failed on PI based regimen, you will give a stronger or better PI, which is darunavir, ritonavir in a double dose, which is BID dose. And if there is TB co-infection, if you are giving protease inhibitor, don't use rifampicin, you give rifabutin based treatment. And this is how you monitor your patients on second line ART, as these drugs or protease inhibitors, which is the main stand of second line treatment in our program, may cause metabolic imbalance and or metabolic syndromes. That is why we use all these tests to monitor metabolic syndromes. And viral load is to be done every 6 months for all patients on second line and third line. And if at any point of time, if viral load is more than 1000, again same algorithm is followed, doing the viral load after repeating the viral load after 3 months of step-up counseling, just to make sure that adherence. Please remember that if the patient is not adherent to one line of treatment, patient will not be adherent to the second line of treatment. So that is why don't think that we are wasting that time, because unless you increase the adherence of the patient, the next line of treatment also will not be successful. So if the second line or repeat viral load is also more than 1000, then you will change from second line to third line, which is preferred third line is raltegravir, darunavir, and ritonavir one tablet twice a day daily. So third line ART will have to be initiated presently in the COE, but at some places it has been also started in the ART plus centers after NACO approvals. But again, you need to some people ask that what after third line? What do we have after third line? Unfortunately, we do not have many drug options available with us to use after third line. In ideal scenarios, we call it as salvage regimen, where we do genotypic testing. We try to identify mutations, and based on the mutation pattern, we try to make the regimen for these patients. Again, though those will not be very much effective, but they may cause suppression of the viral load to a certain level, but they may not cause complete suppression of the viral load. That is why it is called a salvage regimen. So that is what is there after third line, but unfortunately in our system we have very limited access to ART. So that is why the main message from this presentation is know how mutations happen. The one of the biggest problem of mutations, or one of the biggest problem of resistance, is poor adherence. So focus on that. Keep your patient adherent to the ART for longer and longer duration of time on the first line itself, so that they don't require second line. And if they are on second line, take utmost precautions so that closely monitor the patients immunologically and also virologically, so that you will know in time that whenever the patient is not taking ART properly. And you need to reinforce and re-emphasize again and again on the importance of adherence. Then only you will be able to have successful outcome of ART medications. So I've finished my time. If there are if I have missed some questions, in some subset meeting they use abacavir as second line ART in patients exposed to tenofovir. Your opinion, please. That is actually not a good practice. It is not recommended. If someone is failing tenofovir as first line, abacavir should not be used as second line. As we saw in the first part of the presentation, if there is presence of K65R, it may cause resistance to abacavir also. That is why it should never be done. Treat OI and repeat viral load, yes, that is fine. We cannot know that patients do at home. Yes, we don't know what patients do at home, but that is why now we have viral load, and with viral load you can be sure that either the adherence is, and if again enhanced adherence counseling, that doesn't mean that only on paper you need to do session 1, session 2, session 3, but it is actually working closely with the patient to actually work on the adherence to improve the patient's adherence. If the CD4 is between 100 and 200, always what should we do? In some patients there can be CD4 which is always below 100 or 200. It may not increase. Even if you do viral load, it may not, it will be suppressed, but even viral load will be, CD4 will be below 100 or 200. It is called as virological immunological discordance. In those patients, first is do HIV2 testing, because the viral load which we do is for HIV1. So that is first thing which we need to do. Then rule out the co-infection with Hep C, and also rule out the other causes of immunodeficiency. Okay, if there are not no more questions, then I think we can stop. So I thank NACO for the platform, and also I especially thank Dr. Rajshekharan for preparing all these slides for NACO. I thank University of Washington and National HIV Curriculum, from where I took the first part of the slides of the presentation. So and thank you all very much for participation, and see you in the next sessions.
Thank you, sir, for the session today. Thanks to all the participants for patient listening. All participants are requested to kindly enter the e-poll, which will be displayed on the screen shortly. Thank you very much.